What's up, everybody? This is Will with Origami Cybertruck. I wanted to talk today a little bit about this NIO day that recently occurred, and there were a lot of things that NIO dropped on the world that were, kind of exciting for people and stuff like that. And it generated a lot of buzz initially, but then I think there's been a little bit of probably warranted, I don't want to say skepticism, but just evaluation of, okay, well, what did we actually see after the event? One thing I think is really important, just as a side note before we get going, it's really important to be able to look at the contents of an argument or the contents or evaluate the contents of what someone is saying and not at how they're presenting it. There can be lots of flash and impressive stuff, but at the end of the day, it matters the actual content of what they're talking about. So with that in mind, I wanted to talk a little bit about this upcoming ET7, supposedly Tesla Model S competitor self-driving features, because there was a lot of buzz about how it's, this many times more powerful than Tesla and all this other stuff. And so let's just talk a little bit about what these numbers actually mean in context, okay? I don't know if anyone else remembers, but before the age of smartphones, when we were first starting to get digital cameras, my first digital camera I think had like maybe a 1 megapixel camera, and then there was like a 2 megapixel, and then there was a 3, and then before you know it there was like 8 and 10 and 20 megapixels or whatever. And at a certain point, you kind of realized, well, it doesn't actually matter beyond a certain extent how many megapixels the image sensor itself actually has. If, for example, the quality of the lens is poor or the glass is very small, it's not going to produce a very good image regardless. So with that kind of idea in mind, I want to talk about some of these specs because I felt like this presentation was very spec heavy, but not really in context. I don't want anyone to be confused with big numbers without knowing what they mean. Okay, so here are what some of the claims are specifically. 11 8 megapixel high resolution cameras, 1 ultra long range high resolution LiDAR, 5 radar sensors basically, 12 ultrasonics, and 2 high precision positioning units, V2X and ADMS. I actually have a lot to say about these high precision positioning units. Not actually a huge fan of these, but we can talk about that maybe in a different video. But anyway, for now, I'm not going to talk about the ultrasonic sensors. This isn't something that really requires much compute. The radars, again, radars are fairly low resolution, even if they are high resolution for radars. That's not very high resolution in terms of actual number of data points. And I'm also going to ignore the ultra long range high resolution LiDAR because number one, Tesla doesn't even have one of those, and we are going to compare NIO with Tesla. And number two, I don't have any idea what the LiDAR resolution is, so I can't really give a good idea about it, what this sort of means in context. I'm of the camp that I don't think that LiDAR is all that useful and is probably just a drag on the efficiency and overall ability to train something for reasons that, lots of people have gone into. I'm not going to restate that here. If anyone's interested, I could do a video about it, but I think Elon has covered this pretty well.
Fool's errand, and anyone relying on LiDAR is doomed. Doomed.
Okay, we're going to go over here to an Inside EVs article by Tom Moloughney. Tom's great, so hopefully, Tom, you don't mind me using your, this is a teaching implement for a little bit here. So we have 11 8 megapixel high resolution cameras, as we just said, with the Aquila, that is apparently what NIO is calling their overall system here. Okay, that's nice. How does that compare to Tesla? All right, they use 8 1.2 megapixel cameras. Now, the immediate thing you might think here is, wow, 8 megapixels versus 1.2 megapixels. That's so many more megapixels. That's almost 8 times as many. That must be 8 times better. That's not exactly true. We'll talk about that also in a moment. Comparing also here, we've got Tesla's 2 FSD chips that have 144 teraops, that's TOPS, that's trillion operations per second, compared to NVIDIA's 4 Orin chips that produce 1,016 teraops, or trillion operations per second. All right, again, this number sounds very impressive. This is like almost 10 times more than Tesla, what they're claiming. But what does that actually mean? All right. First of all, we need to do a quick primer on what a neural network is and does. And for that, I'm going to go over to video here. This is 3 blue, 1 brown. If you haven't seen that, I will have a link to this in the notes. You should check this video out. It's amazing. I'm just going to play a little bit of it to show you kind of an idea. This is a 28 by 28 pixel array. In this case, he's showing what a pixel array for handwriting would be, but just imagine that these are pixels just like in a video image. And you see here that 28 times 28 gives you 784. That's the number of pixels. So, that'd be like, 0.00, however many zeros, 784 megapixels, all right? The way a neural network works is you literally just take all of these rows of pixels and then stack them all together and then assign values of activations here for these perceptrons or these neurons. So he's going to show this image just getting disassembled here and literally stacked up. You take that entire line and basically it forms the first layer of nodes in a neural network matrix. So I'm going to pause it here. Again, check this out if you're not really familiar with neural networks. It's a lot to go into, but fundamentally, you take this entire line of input data. And this, in the case of like a self-driving vision system, this entire input network would be all of the lines of all of the pixels of each camera just literally put into one big line. And then you have these intermediary kind of nodes, and you have these connections, these weights. If you've heard people refer to the weights of a neural network, that's what these connection strengths are between these different layers. And then at the output, you have output layer. You have some sort of, what do we want this to do? What is this? In this case, this sample or example is for a handwriting recognition for the numbers. So you would have all of these things. You train this network, and then you'd assign a probability to, well, what number are we looking at here on the output? All right, so it'll give you some probability between 0 and 1 that it is one of these things. So kind of like a super, super quick and dirty introductory to neural networks. Again, check out 3 blue, 1 brown. Amazing work, and I've learned a ton from this channel, and it's can't recommend it highly enough. All right. So moving on from there, we're going to go back to this. All right, so I've taken all of these pieces of data here, and I've put them into a spreadsheet. All right, so we're going to compare the NIO versus the Tesla FSD. We're only going to compare cameras, as I said. So check it out. 11 cameras quoted by NIO, 8 from Tesla, 8 megapixels versus 1.2. So I'm just going to literally multiply these two together to get the total number of megapixels. So to just get a rough idea about how much data we're going to be working with. So we got 88 megapixels worth of data here with the NIO system versus 9.6 with the Tesla system. Teraops, trillion operations per second. This is how fast we're able to process all of the all of this kind of inference as we're taking all these, plugging in an image, running it through this matrix or this neural network, and figuring out what we're seeing, what we should do about it, etc. on the other side. And that's how many of those discrete little operations per second it can do. So again, this number is higher, obviously, than Tesla's full self-driving computer number, right? But what I think is kind of interesting and critically important is if we say, well, okay, how much of these operations per pixel, like what is the overall horsepower that we're looking at here in sort of a related sense? If we divide the teraops per pixel, and again, this is a very crude sort of measure. So, anyone out there who's like, a data scientist or machine learning or AI specialist, understand that this is just meant to be a crude approximation because we don't know all of the details inside anyway. But this gives us a rough idea about how much, essentially compute per input data unit we're actually getting out of this thing. And so even though with the NIO system, it seems like it's much more powerful than the Tesla FSD computer, and it is on its face, we actually have less operations per pixel, so less compute per data unit available from the beginning. And that doesn't even take into account the fact that some of this is probably going to get consumed as well with LiDAR. So what does that mean? Well, from a practical standpoint, it means that all else being equal, and I don't know that it is, but all else being equal, you would be able to process fewer frames per second with the NIO system than you actually would be with the Tesla FSD computer. That's important because at low speeds, it may not matter that much. If you're only driving at, say, 15 or 20 or 30 miles an hour, the world isn't changing as fast around you. But if you're driving down the highway, things are changing a lot faster. So your ability to process more frames per second is actually quite relevant to what you're going to be doing. Let's also talk, before we kind of talk about power consumption, and we will get to that, but let's also talk a little bit about, well, what does this mean, this resolution? If we're looking at NIO's system, they said it's about 8 megapixels. That puts us about in the 4K region of resolution. So as you can see from this table, this is Wikipedia display resolution. You've got about 8 megapixels at 4K. That's 3,840 pixels wide by 2,100 high. Compare that to what Tesla is at about 1.2 megapixels. That puts us in like the WXGA kind of region here. That's like 1440 by 900. So if you look at that, that's, a little more than double the dimensions in height and width. So when we're talking double the dimensions, we're talking like about 4K versus something that's somewhere between 720 and 1080p. So we're actually talking about, although it's many more pixels, it's actually not that much more pixel density in terms of how clear the image is actually going to be. Again, so the images that we're feeding into the computer, like it's worth asking the question, are you really going to get that much more useful data out of something that has this many pixels if you're a computer than something that has like this many pixels if you're a computer? We've seen a lot of very good videos at this point from the Tesla full self-driving beta come out that I think demonstrates pretty clearly that the 1.2 megapixel camera is sufficient to view the world around it. And it's just really not clear to me what the benefit you really get from putting all this additional data in. It just increases the amount of compute that you need so much. But you're only really increasing your view by about double in each direction. So that I think that's worth asking, like, what is the value of this? Now, from a practical standpoint, it's like, okay, well, fine. If they want to put a bunch of extra computers in there that maybe don't do all that much, great. But what are the implications of that? Well, as I said before, they're using the Orin chip in there. So if we look at some of NVIDIA's system on chip comparisons here, they're 2-unit Tegra Orin chip computer here, which has 2 of these neural network processing engines for a total of 400 teraops. That's if you have to double that because they've got 4. So 2 of these, doubling it, you get 4. So that gets you up to about 800 terops. How they came up with 1,000, I don't know. Maybe there's a new version of the chip coming out or something like that. But at that rate, you're using 130 watts for one of those. Now you've got to double that to get to that 800 mark, and maybe even add a bit more. But we'll be on the conservative side for them and say 260 watts. Compare that to Tesla's full self-driving computer, which uses only 72 watts. So they're consuming 3.6 times the power with this NIO system as the Tesla full self-driving system. Another thing that's important to note is that this is what they plan to have out in 2022, and this is what Tesla already has out. Tesla has a version, hardware for a new version of the full self-driving computer coming out. We don't know the specs of it exactly, but it's going to provide more compute with less energy, you can be sure of that. So we can probably anticipate this power consumption actually going down, and probably these terops going up slightly. And that's going to further increase this essentially efficiency of per pixel, efficiency overall of this system. All right, so now that we've talked about the technical differences between the physical compute hardware and image sensing of NIO versus Tesla, let's pull it out just a little bit here, because the important thing here is context, right? Okay, there's a concept in computer science called GIGO, which is garbage in, garbage out. Essentially what this means is the ability to compute something, the ability for an algorithm or for a system to deal with data is only as good as the information that you're putting into it. This is true always, but this is incredibly important when you're talking about AI and self-driving. And the reason is the more real-world data that you have, the more information you can not program in, but the more information you can train the neural network model to begin with, the more accurate and the more representative of a real-world output you're going to get. So even though NIO on paper has the ability to process more data overall, now again, we don't know if that's actually really all that valuable. Like in our camera example, if you have a really high megapixel camera, but you have a really tiny crummy lens, you're going to get a bad picture, and it's not going to be that great. You'd be better off, all things being equal, to have a really great quality lens and a reasonable quality digital sensor for your actual image sensor. How does this relate to the cars? Well, let's look at NIO's sales. All right, in Q3 2020, we don't have the 2020 Q4 deliveries yet on Hypercharts. Shout out Gally and Hypercharts crew here. They did like 12,000 deliveries in Q3 2020. And that was just in China. Compare that to what Tesla did. Now this is worldwide, to be fair, but they did 180,000 vehicle deliveries in that, well, 139,000 deliveries in that same quarter if we're comparing apples to apples here. And you can see Tesla's just taking off. They're opening more factories. They're getting vastly more cars out on the road than NIO is. Again, if you compare NIO, their best quarter so far, 12.2 thousand vehicles delivered in Q3. I mean, you have to go back before this chart even starts to get that few cars with Tesla. So we're talking two different leagues, and the implications of that is that we're talking way more data being generated and collected and processed by Tesla than NIO. And so even if you had the best computer in the world in NIO, if they just simply have 100 times less data because they have 100 times fewer cars, or even just 10 times fewer cars, and so many fewer miles, it just doesn't matter how good the hardware is, because data is what's really important. That raw, real-world data that's fed into the neural network training systems that runs on these computers. So that's all I wanted to say right now. If there's anybody who is trained in data science, neural networks, AI, love to hear what you have to think. Did I miss anything here? Anything you wanted to add? Put it in the comments. All right, see you later.